Rev up your engines! Today I'm going to talk about the killer of modern engines, carbon that can carbon it out, and how you can prevent it in the first place. Now, if you haven't heard about it, especially in modern gasoline direct injection engines, carbon builds up in the engine and creates havoc in a modern engine. Sometimes it's so bad, you have to take the engine apart so you can access the valves of the engine, the top all covered with carbon. As you look inside here, you can see, man, this thing is full of built up carbon. It's even worse inside. A fancy carbon blaster. This one is by O'Toole. Hook it up to an air compressor. Here's the air power. Goes here. It's the same thing as a sandblaster, only it uses walnut shells. You can see tiny little walnut shells. They're not as hard. Sand would destroy your head. This doesn't hurt the head. You fill it up with this, then you gotta blast that carbon out. One, it's a messy, labor-intensive job. In order to use the machine on most engines, you gotta take a bunch of the engine apart to access it. So, of course, it's gonna cost you a small fortune. Let me check it out. This is an involved job. You get the wand, you turn on a machine, and you gotta blast all that carbon out. And then, of course, understand one thing. You haven't fixed the root problem. And if you don't, it'll happen again and you'll have to take it apart and clean it all over again. Or pay somebody a small fortune to do it. So, I'm going to show you how to keep the carbon from building up in the first place. Now, unfortunately for the owner of the car, he just bought it used. He had no idea. And the engine's all carboned up because the previous owner was a slob. Let's look at all the crud that's in the spark plugs I took out. This is now an oil burner, carbon creating engine, which, Lexus should last a really long time. And now it's not going to because it wasn't taken care of. Now, yes, I got it all back together and it's running fine now. But the underlying problem in this car, the carbon got so bad and the oil wasn't changed that the piston rings are worn, it's going to continue to foul up the spark plugs. And you might say, great, I'll just change the spark plugs more often. You saw what a job it is, taking the whole intake off to change the 3 on the driver's side. You want to prevent the stuff in the first place. You want to use good oil. You want to change it regularly. And you want to use quality fuel that burns correctly. Now, generally here in the United States, it's not a problem getting good fuel. Most fuels perfectly fine. The gas stations have fiberglass tanks. They don't get water in it. Fuel's not a real problem these days. A regular station all the time, and you don't have any problems. Just keep using the same ones. But that's not usually that much of a problem in the United States. It's the other end, the lubrication oil, where the problem is really created, especially in gasoline direct injections, where carbon will build up. So, the most crucial thing is to use the right oil. The oil that your car was designed for. Modern cars, all of them can use this GF6 oil. So you don't get extra carbon buildup on the engine, especially for GDI systems. Now the problem with GDI systems are the original systems, the fuel injector sprayed fuel. And they sprayed fuel over the intake valves. That kept the intake valves clean. GDI engines, on the other hand, they spray the fuel directly into the cylinder. Nothing hits the intake valves but air, and unfortunately, with the positive crankcase ventilation system, crankcase vapors, which have oil in them, which then build up the carbon on the valves. And in the case of many Volkswagens, you have to actually blast them off with that walnut blasting. The only thing they can get it out, take the engine apart, it gets so bad. The main thing is you want to change your oil regularly and use the right oil. But it's not just oil, it's the oil filter. This is the Bosch premium oil filter. There's lots of premium oil filters out there. They all work great. They can hold impurities for 10,000 miles or more. The cheap oil filters, mostly are rated for 3,000 miles. Once they go over 3,000 miles, the filtration material will get filled up, and then inside all the filters, the good ones and the cheap ones, there's little bypass valves. So if the filter gets clogged up, rather than clogging up and then you don't have any oil flow in your engine blows up, it opens up and then it bypasses and doesn't filter at all. If you have a cheap oil filter on, and you change your oil 10,000 miles, you're going to have a lot of unfiltered oil going in your engine, going to clog things up, you're going to have problems. You want to use the best filter you can buy, unless you're changing the oil every 3,000 miles, which most people don't do anymore. Filter's extremely important. You don't want it bypassing a filter, and then there's unfiltered oil, which will clog your engine up. Now, let's say you have a Volkswagen, you're worried. In that case, sometimes Putting on one of these oil catch cans is a smart idea. Instead of getting oil and vapors getting into your engine and messing up the intake valves, this will stop it. Sometimes you have to go that far. You put this on the PCV and all the oil is separated in the bottom. So you don't get the oil and oil vapor inside your valves on the intake and clog them up. Some cars are poorly designed and they need that. You take the modern Toyotas, they got a dual system where fuel injectors are both on the intake manifold and GDI. The system cleans itself. They haven't had any problems with them carboning up. You got something like a Volkswagen, not a bad idea to put an oil catch can on. Or let's say you got an engine that burns some oil, even more reason, because you're going to get even more vapors getting inside the thing. These oil catch cans can easily be put on. They're very simple. This is a cool one because look, it's got a dipstick. So when it starts to fill up with oil, you check it every once in a while. When it gets full, you empty the thing out. You don't have to buy another one. You just empty it out every once in a while. And really, these oil catch cans are pretty easy to install. Hey, you got to redesign a car? Well, because they didn't design them right in the first place. What can you do? This will prevent quite a bit, especially if you got an old oil burner or something like that. They do work. You want to make sure you got clean oil, the right oil. A good filter that can last. Because when I was a young mechanic, it was a problem, but it was a problem because the oil wasn't as good. The engines weren't as good metallurgy. The gasoline wasn't as good as it is today. Pretty much before GDI injection systems came in for cars, it was a non-existent problem unless you really took horrible care of your car, because the gasoline was cleaning the intake valves and it couldn't build up carbon that they can in the modern cars because of the GDI. Basically, GDI is kind of a reverse step evolutionarily. It makes the cars run worse. And it can do so in a very short period of time. I've seen Volkswagens with 15,000 miles on them didn't run right. As I said earlier, Toyota's got that new system, GDI injectors on the engine, but they also have regular port injectors on the intake manifold so the valves don't get clogged up. It's a very complex system. It does work, but there are many cars out there that if you don't take care of them, you don't change the oil right and use the right oil and filter, you're going to get it carboned up. So let's say you're one of those people that has a carboned up engine. Well, you saw earlier what a pain it is to take the intake manifold off, walnut blast all the carbon out. You don't want it to get that far. Now, there are various cleaners out there, like this Lucas Deep Clean GDI. You got to spray it into the intake, and to some extent, it'll clean some off. The problem is, as with any cleaner, it depends on where the carbon is, what type of carbon is built up. Realize there's like 3 different kinds of carbon that can build up. So it's a lot more complex than you might think. If you did get stuck not maintaining a car or buying a used car, like this guy did with all the carbon stuff in it, I found these ATS guys in New Mexico. They make some interesting products. You just pour the fuel treatment into the gas tank. And if you want to do the whole thing, one for the oil, you pour it in the engine oil, then let it sit for like 15-20 minutes at 1,500, 2,000 RPMs. So it cleans all the carbon off the piston rings and off of everything that the oil lubricates, the valves, it cleans that off. Then you change the oil and filter. I personally like Castrol. I've been using it since I was a kid. Plenty of other oils out there that are good. My thing is, hey, if I use something all my life and it works fine, I'm going to continue using it until it doesn't work and I'll switch to something else. But if you got a GDI engine and they're making these engines smaller and smaller and more complex, like the Nissan Rogue that's now going to have a 1.5 liter turbocharged variable compression engine in them starting this year. All that complex stuff, you don't want to ruin it by not having clean oil in it. You don't want those things carbonating up. You're already straining it enough with GDI, variable compression in the case of the Nissan. You don't want to chance these complex systems bringing a bunch of dirty carbon in because you didn't change your oil right or used a cheap filter. Let's say you did get stuff covered with carbon. You try one of these sprays, right? Let's say you got a whole bunch of carbon on the intake. If this breaks the carbon loose, what if big chunks come off? It could ruin your turbocharger, jamming the piston rings. All kinds of bad things can happen. And interestingly enough, this is the reason that I find ATS guys in Albuquerque to have the best machine for actually cleaning. These guys aren't idiots. They spent years setting this stuff up. Some companies even say don't ever use those cleaners, it can ruin the turbo. Their cleaning system breaks down to 3 different types of carbon, but it also includes an accelerant that burns it away. So it breaks it and burns it off so it doesn't damage anything. Guys thought of a lot of stuff when they made that machine. Now, yeah, it's a $5,500 machine. You're not going to be buying one, but real mechanics that do this kind of work seriously, you tell a customer, okay, do you want to spend $700, $800, $900 taking the engine apart, or maybe even more, and walnut blasting the carbon out? Or if they've got a machine like that, they'll charge whatever for a service. It's going to be a lot less than that. And if it actually cleans it out without disassembling all that thing, a winning solution as far as I'm concerned. Although truthfully, it's just making the best of a bad situation. You don't want to get the carbon in the first place by cleaning the oil and stuff. When I was a young mechanic, I mean, back then, same thing, you know? You got to change your oil, the engine will fall apart. Well, back in those days, it was because the oil wasn't that good, the engine metallurgy wasn't that good, the oil's better, the metallurgy's better, the gasoline's better. Don't ruin the whole thing by not changing your oil. Because let's say you got carbon built up on the valves bad, and you spray one of these spray cleaners on the induction, and it actually starts breaking the carbon off. It can destroy your turbocharger, which usually costs at least $1,500 more to replace on most cars, and some have two, so you can multiply that by 2. Don't have that happen in the first place. But if you do, my advice is find somebody who's got one of Bernie's machines and pay them to clean it. That makes the most sense. Of course, if you want to try it yourself, and these bottles are like $24 a piece. So for $50, see if it helps. Just realize cleaning is like anything else. People say they watch my videos cleaning catalytic converters so they can pass the emissions test because the catalytic converters are inefficient. Cleaning might work, cleaning might not work. Just like radiator sealers. Depends on where the hole is, how big it is. Some work perfectly fine for years. Sometimes the holes are just too big. Since radiators are plastic and aluminum, if the plastic's all hardened and it's cracking, you put in a sealer, it might fix one crack, but the whole thing's cracked. It'll just be cracking somewhere else. So the whole thing here is maintenance. And if you do have a GDI car, use that GF6 oil. That's the new oil that's made exactly for them, for their timing chains, to not build up carbon, to not make the piston rings stick. The engineers spent a lot of time designing this stuff. And I know some people say, they don't have it at the local auto parts store, I can't get it. Blah. Get it, who cares? Buy it online, go to Amazon, buy the stuff. There's plenty of places you can buy it. Just because they don't have the oil you want. Say, well, they don't have a 0W16 oil that my car calls for. Don't buy another oil and put it in. Go get the right oil. If it's 0W16 in your GDI, buy it. Put it in. And if you got an older one, there's the backwards GF6 oil. They're not 016, they can be 010, 020. You want to use the GF6 oil in any GDI engine. I had a customer do it with his Honda. And let me tell you, he did an oil analysis. And he found out he had bad oil dilution from gasoline getting into the oil. Then he switched to the GF6 oil, and then it had only a tiny trace amount in the engine oil after that. The gasoline dilution was almost nothing. Instead of having like 0.7, it was minimal. The stuff, that oil does work. But don't say, well, they don't have it at the store. Don't make your car's livelihood depend on what's at your local store. They don't have it, buy it somewhere else. But don't cheap on the oil on a GDI engine, or you'll regret it. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.